I think the greatest challenge for officials was this issue of how you rebuild entire cities. And of course, people had insurance, but in many cases, insurance wasn't enough. Sometimes insurance companies didn't pay enough in order to allow people to rebuild their homes. Other times, people simply didn't have insurance for a multitude of reasons. People didn't have insurance. But whatever the case might be, it remained true for leaders that they had to find a way to rebuild communities. And so they had an interesting idea. They would create something called the Road Home Program, which would literally become a way for people to get back into their homes, in that it would provide grants to people to rebuild single-family homes and allow them to get back into their homes and hopefully find some level of normalcy post-Katrina.
The Road Home Program would take into account the pre-storm value of the home that had been destroyed and base the rebuilding grant on the pre-storm value of the home rather than on the cost of repairing or rebuilding the home. And so here at the Fair Housing Action Center, what we came to see during our housing counseling work was that many of the African American clients who were seeking rebuilding grants under the Road Home Program were being offered lower rebuilding grants than were white homeowners, even when the sizes of their home was similar. There was similar square footage, similar in age, similar in style, and the cost of rebuilding was similar. African Americans, because their homes were valued lower if they lived in black neighborhoods, were offered smaller grants than were white homeowners, even when the homes were comparable.
This goes back decades and decades to just practices that were sanctioned by government that really separated neighborhoods by race, and then determined that white neighborhoods were good investments and black neighborhoods weren't. And of course, because the neighborhoods were separated by race, blacks couldn't invest in those neighborhoods. They couldn't move into the white neighborhoods that the private sector and government determined to be the best places. So because of this history of separation, racial separation, and because banks and insurance companies treated African American neighborhoods as less valuable, considered them less valuable, we have different property values that are associated with race in this city as in any other city. And so after Katrina, when it was time to decide how to make grant awards to homeowners whose properties were devastated by the storm, African Americans were penalized for the lower property values that that their properties had, and not because of any individual actions on their part, but because of this historic separation, segregation, and the different property values that existed in white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods.
If an African American homeowner was seeking to rebuild a home that cost $150,000 to rebuild, and the value of their home pre-Katrina was at $100,000, then they were facing a $50,000 gap in the funding that it would take to rebuild. Whereas on the other hand, if a white homeowner who also was facing $150,000 worth of damage, if their home was valued pre-Katrina at $140,000, then their gap to cover the cost of rebuilding was only $10,000. And so African American homeowners were then facing larger gaps in what it would take to rebuild versus what they had been awarded under the Road Homes Program. After our housing counselors came to realize that the rebuilding grant formula that the Road Home Program was using had a disparate impact on African American homeowners, the Fair Housing Action Center, along with some other fair housing advocates from across the country, filed suit alleging that the Road Homes Program was discriminatory.
The Road Home Program, by relying on home values rather than repair costs, builds on repugnant segregation and threatens New Orleans' success. The Road Home program in HUD must challenge historic segregation in New Orleans by revising its formula to provide assistance in a non-discriminatory manner. As most people know, New Orleans' recovery has been slow and arduous, and at some points stagnant. Regrettably, this stagnation is more evident in African American neighborhoods. Anyone who visits New Orleans East or the Lower Ninth Ward, two predominantly African American communities, will observe thousands of unrenovated and partially renovated homes. The core issue is that property owners do not have adequate resources to rebuild. The Road Home program had the potential to ensure adequate and fair rebuilding for New Orleans homeowners, but has fallen woefully short. The judge was very clear that he was concerned that it was likely that the Road Home program was set up in a way that disadvantaged people who lived in majority African American neighborhoods. But the judge also felt like it was unlikely that he had the authority to force the state government to make a change in the program.
Because the Road Home program failed to take into account this country's history of residential segregation and discrimination, we're still continuing to see the effects of that program and the lack of ability to rebuild today. Many neighborhoods in the city that are historically African American now see vacancy rates 10 years post-Katrina that are astronomically higher than they were pre-Katrina. And we know that the Road Home program certainly played a part in the lack of many African American homeowners to rebuild post-Katrina. The city currently is whiter and wealthier than it was pre-Katrina. And this in and of itself doesn't create a problem, but the fact that African Americans haven't had the same opportunity to return to the city that they've called home is certainly problematic.
The settlement was a step in the right direction towards getting more hurricane-affected homeowners back into their homes and making good on the promise to rebuild a better New Orleans. But the truth is that the settlement came in 2011, which was a tremendously late recovery start for primarily African American homeowners that had been left behind. While the formula was ruled discriminatory by a federal judge, in the meantime many people had made homes elsewhere or were overwhelmed by the costs of prolonged displacement. To date, the settlement has resulted in $16 million to hundreds of homeowners, but of course millions more remain to be dispersed.